Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. What I'm about to show you today is something you almost never get to see. We're talking about actual cockpit voice recorder audio, the real voices of pilots during one of the most terrifying incidents in recent aviation history. This isn't speculation, this isn't a recreation. These are the actual words spoken inside a cockpit when everything went catastrophically wrong in the most unexpected way possible. And I want you to stick with me through this entire video because what unfolds in these recordings will change the way you think about aviation safety forever. Before we get into the audio itself, I need to explain why this is so incredibly rare. Cockpit voice recorders exist on every commercial aircraft, but the audio from these devices is almost never released to the public. You might get a transcript sometimes, maybe a few lines in an official report, but hearing the actual voices, the fear, the urgency, the split-second decisions being made when lives hang in the balance, that almost never happens. The reasons for this are complicated, and I'll get into them later. But for now, just understand that what you're about to hear represents an extraordinary glimpse behind the curtain into a world that's usually kept completely private. So let's talk about what happened on this flight. We're going back to October of 2023. And the aircraft in question is Horizon Air Flight 2059, departing from Everett, Washington, with a destination of San Francisco, California. On board this aircraft, you've got over 80 passengers who have absolutely no idea what's about to unfold just a few feet away from them in the cockpit. You've got two pilots up front, professionals who are running through their standard procedures, managing the aircraft, doing everything they've been trained to do thousands of times before. Everything appears completely normal, just another routine flight among the tens of thousands that happen every single day across the country. But there's a third person in that cockpit, and this is where our story really begins. In modern commercial aviation, there's something called a jump seat. For those of you who aren't pilots or deeply familiar with how airlines operate, the jump seat is essentially an extra seat in the cockpit. Sometimes there's a third seat, sometimes there's even a fourth, depending on the aircraft type. These seats are reserved almost exclusively for pilots who need to commute to and from their work assignments. It's one of those professional courtesies that exists in the airline industry. If you're a pilot and you need to get from city A to city B to start your shift, rather than taking up a revenue passenger seat in the cabin, you can ride up front in the cockpit with your fellow aviators. It's based on trust, on professional respect, on the understanding that everyone in that cockpit is part of the same community with the same training and the same commitment to safety. The person occupying that jump seat on Flight 2059 was a man named Joseph Emerson. He was an off-duty Alaska Airlines pilot, and on paper, he was exactly the kind of person who should be sitting in that seat, a trained professional, someone who understood the operation, someone who would never dream of interfering with the flight. But something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with Emerson that day. Something that the two pilots at the controls had absolutely no way of knowing about until events began to unfold in the most horrifying way imaginable. Now, to understand what happens next, you need to know what was going on in Joseph Emerson's life leading up to this moment. About a week prior to this flight, he had lost a friend. Someone close to him had died, and he was dealing with grief in ways that clearly indicated he was not in a stable mental state. But it gets worse. Approximately 2 days before he boarded this aircraft and sat down in that jump seat, Emerson had consumed psychedelic mushrooms. We're talking about hallucinogenic drugs, substances that can profoundly alter your perception of reality, your judgment, your mental state. And here's the critical part that every pilot watching this will immediately recognize as a massive violation of regulations. Pilots are absolutely prohibited from using substances like this. And if you do, you're required to self-report it to your employer and to the FAA. You can't just take hallucinogens on your day off and then show up for work 2 days later pretending everything is fine. But that's exactly what Emerson did. He would later tell investigators that he hadn't slept in 40 hours. Think about that for a second. No sleep for nearly 2 days, still dealing with the effects of psychedelic drugs in his system, grieving the loss of a friend, and sitting in the cockpit of a commercial aircraft with over 80 people on board. He would later claim that he thought he was dreaming, that none of what was happening felt real to him. Whether you believe that explanation or not, and I'll give you my thoughts on that in a minute, the fact remains that this man was in a severely compromised mental state and nobody around him had any idea. So now let's get to the audio. What you're about to hear is the cockpit voice recorder capturing the moments when the first officer, that's the co-pilot, starts to realize something is seriously wrong with the person sitting behind him. Listen carefully to the tone, the concern in his voice, because this is a pilot who's trained to handle emergencies, but nothing in his training prepared him for what's about to happen.
Who's that? You're okay? What's that? What's wrong? You want to be home? What's going on? All right, then we need to make an emergency.
All right, let me stop right there and break down what you just heard. That exchange you're hearing is almost entirely the first officer speaking. The co-pilot has picked up on something. Maybe it's body language, maybe he heard something unusual, maybe he just got that gut feeling that every experienced aviator develops over years of flying that tells you something isn't right. Whatever triggered his awareness, he's turned his attention to Emerson, and you can hear him trying to engage, trying to figure out what's going on. If I'm sitting in that right seat and I notice the jump seat occupant starting to act strangely, my immediate response is going to be exactly what you hear in this audio. I'm going to loosen my seatbelt a little bit so I have freedom of movement. I'm going to turn around in my seat so I can make eye contact with this person. I'm going to start asking questions, gentle at first, trying to assess the situation without escalating anything. Listen to how the first officer approaches this. He's almost taking on the role of a therapist in that moment. What's wrong? What's going on? You want to be home? These aren't the kinds of questions you ask during a normal flight. These are the questions you ask when you recognize that someone is having a breakdown, when you're trying to keep them calm while simultaneously preparing for the possibility that this situation could deteriorate rapidly. And you can hear in Emerson's responses, though they're faint in the background and some of the language has been edited out by the news media, that he's not okay. He's expressing that he wants to be home. He's clearly emotional, and the situation is becoming increasingly unstable. Now, here's where things go from concerning to absolutely terrifying. Emerson, sitting in that jump seat with both fire handles directly in front of his face, maybe 12 inches away at most, reaches forward and grabs both of them. For those of you who don't know what fire handles do, let me explain. These are the controls that shut down the engines. In the event of an actual engine fire, a pilot would pull these handles, which cuts off fuel flow to the engines and activates the fire suppression systems. They're bright red, they're impossible to miss, and they're positioned right there within easy reach of anyone sitting in the jump seat. And Emerson grabbed both of them and started pulling, trying to shut down both engines simultaneously while the aircraft was in flight with over 80 people on board. I want you to think about what that means for just a second. If he had been successful, if those handles had come out the way he intended, both engines would have stopped producing thrust. You'd have a commercial aircraft full of passengers suddenly transformed into a glider, with the pilots scrambling to restart engines or find somewhere, anywhere, to put that aircraft down safely. This wasn't just a mental health crisis anymore. This was an attempted mass casualty event, whether Emerson understood that in his altered mental state or not. But here's the thing that saved everyone on that aircraft. The engineers who designed these systems understood that these controls are positioned in a place where someone could potentially grab them accidentally, or in a worst case scenario like this one, intentionally, so they built in a safety mechanism called a detent. It's a two-step process to actually pull those fire handles if there isn't a real fire. I'm not going to sit here and explain exactly how the detent system works, and I'm doing that deliberately because I don't want anyone getting ideas about how to defeat that system. But the bottom line is that Emerson, in his compromised state, didn't know about this safety feature. He grabbed those handles, he pulled on them, and they didn't come out. The system worked exactly as designed. And that's probably the only reason everyone on that aircraft survived. But the first officer isn't waiting around to see if Emerson figures out how to defeat the detent system. The moment those hands reach for those handles, the co-pilot is on him. He's physically fighting with Emerson, wrestling him away from those controls. And you can hear the struggle beginning in the audio. Now, you might be wondering why both pilots don't immediately jump on this guy and restrain him. The answer is simple, and it's drilled into every commercial pilot from day one of training. Someone has to fly the airplane. You can't have both pilots in the front leaving their seats and getting into a physical altercation in the cockpit while the aircraft is on autopilot, or worse, not on autopilot. One pilot flies, one pilot fights, and that's exactly what happens here. The captain, sitting in the left seat, immediately declares an emergency. He's on the radio telling air traffic control that they need to land this airplane right away, that they've got a situation that requires immediate action. Meanwhile, the first officer is dealing with the physical threat, subduing Emerson, getting him away from those fire handles, and based on what happened next, getting him out of the cockpit entirely. From what I understand, it wasn't a prolonged wrestling match. The first officer managed to get control of the situation relatively quickly, but the adrenaline, the fear, the sheer disbelief at what just happened, that's going to stay with you for a while. Now, there's been some discussion about what happened after Emerson was removed from the cockpit. Some reports suggest that he attempted to open one of the cabin doors while the aircraft was still in flight. If that's true, and I have reason to believe it is, then that completely destroys his later claim that he thought he was dreaming. Because once you've been physically fought, once you've been thrown out of the cockpit, once you're in the cabin trying to open an emergency exit, you're awake. You know exactly what you're doing. And that makes me believe that this wasn't just a drug-induced hallucination or a mental health episode. I think this was a suicide attempt, and he was willing to take everyone else with him. Let's listen to the second portion of this cockpit voice recorder, because this is where you really hear the aftermath, the breathlessness, the adrenaline, the sheer panic of what these pilots just went through.
Who's that? You're okay? What's that? What's wrong? You want to be home? What's going on? All right, then we need to make an emergency.
Listen to that voice. That's almost certainly the captain speaking now, and he is out of breath. His voice is elevated. There's an urgency and a shakiness that you don't normally hear from airline captains because these are people trained to remain calm under pressure. But this isn't a normal emergency. This isn't an engine failure or a hydraulic problem or even severe weather. This is someone tried to kill us, and you can hear that reality in his voice. He's telling air traffic control that the jump seat occupant just tried to shut off both engines, that they need vectors directly to Portland for an emergency landing, and you can hear the disbelief mixed with the professionalism as he's communicating this information. Then you hear something else in the background, an automated voice saying, "Throttle, throttle." That's the aircraft's own protection system, recognizing that the airplane is getting too slow. During that struggle in the cockpit, while one pilot was physically restraining Emerson and the other was declaring an emergency and trying to manage the situation, nobody was actively flying the airplane in that precise moment. The speed bled off. The aircraft started getting into a dangerous flight regime, and the automated systems did exactly what they're designed to do. They warned the pilots that they needed to add power immediately. You hear one of the pilots respond, "I got throttle," confirming that they're back in control of the aircraft's energy state. Then comes something that every pilot is trained to do, and it's one of the most important communications that can happen in a cockpit during a crisis. You hear the pilots confirming who has control of the aircraft. You got the airplane. I got the plane. This is what we call breaking the startle effect. When something shocking happens, something completely outside the realm of normal operations, there's a human tendency to freeze for just a moment. Your brain is trying to process what just happened, trying to reconcile what you just experienced with what you thought was possible. Pilots don't have the luxury of that freeze moment. We have to act immediately, and one of the ways we train to overcome that startle effect is through very clear, very assertive communication about who is flying the aircraft. The pilot in command will say very firmly, "My aircraft," or "I have the airplane," and the other pilot responds, "Your aircraft," or "You have it," confirming that everyone is clear about roles and responsibilities. In this case, you're hearing that exchange happen in real time. One pilot is taking positive control of flying the aircraft while the other handles everything else: the communications, the checklists, the coordination with air traffic control, making sure the cabin crew is aware of what's happening. All of that administrative work that still has to get done, even in the middle of a crisis. Now, let me address something that I know a lot of you are wondering. Why is this audio so rare? Why don't we hear cockpit voice recorder audio from other incidents? The answer to that question is complicated, and it involves unions, privacy concerns, legal considerations, and the very real possibility that releasing this kind of audio can be used to destroy people's lives and careers without proper context. There's been tremendous controversy over the years about whether to install cameras in cockpits, about how long cockpit voice recorders should retain data, and about who should have access to that data. Congress recently authorized in the last FAA reauthorization bill a requirement for 24-hour cockpit voice recorders in new aircraft. Right now, most systems only record 2 to 3 hours of audio, which means if something happened early in a flight and the aircraft completes that flight safely, that audio might get recorded over before anyone realizes they need to preserve it. But beyond the technical aspects, there's a human element here that's really important to understand. The unions that represent pilots have fought very hard to keep cockpit voice recorder audio private and confidential, except for official investigations. Their argument, and it's not without merit, is that everything said in a cockpit has context. Pilots might be having conversations about personal matters, they might be discussing company policies, they might say something that sounds bad when isolated but makes perfect sense when you understand everything else that was happening at that moment. In today's social media environment, it's incredibly easy to take a snippet of audio, remove all context, and use it to destroy someone's reputation, end their career, or worse. The audio gets edited, it gets shared, it goes viral, and by the time the full truth comes out, the damage is already done. So the compromise that's been in place for decades is that the people who need to hear this audio, the NTSB investigators, the FAA officials, the judges and attorneys involved in any legal proceedings, they all get full access, but the general public does not, specifically to protect the individuals involved and to ensure that the focus remains on learning from incidents rather than sensationalizing them. So why did this particular audio get released? My understanding is that because this incident resulted in extensive legal proceedings, because Joseph Emerson was arrested and charged with multiple crimes, the cockpit voice recorder became part of the public court record. And once those legal proceedings concluded, once the judge issued her ruling, that audio was no longer protected in the same way, which is why we're able to hear it now, more than a year after the incident occurred. And speaking of that legal outcome, let's talk about what happened to Joseph Emerson after this flight. The aircraft made an emergency landing in Portland, Oregon. Emerson was arrested and he did the perp walk that you saw in the news footage. He faced multiple felony charges and he spent the next couple of years fighting those charges in court. The case drew national attention because it highlighted so many issues: mental health in aviation, the use of psychedelic drugs even off duty, the vulnerability of the jump seat system. All of it became part of a broader conversation about aviation safety and pilot wellness. Ultimately, Judge Amy Baggio, who presided over the case, sentenced Emerson to time served plus community service. He did not receive additional jail time beyond what he'd already spent in custody. The judge took into account the extenuating circumstances, his mental state, the fact that he had no prior history of anything like this, and made a decision that was controversial to say the least. Some people felt it was too lenient given that he'd endangered 80 lives. Others felt that treating this as primarily a mental health issue rather than a criminal one was the appropriate response. I'm not here to tell you which perspective is correct. That's not my role. But I will say that from a pilot's perspective, the idea that someone in that mental state was allowed anywhere near the controls of an aircraft is deeply troubling. Let's talk about the self-reporting issue, because this is crucial. As a pilot, you are required by federal regulations to report certain medical conditions, certain medications, and yes, certain substance use to the FAA. If you take psychedelic mushrooms on your day off, you cannot just show up for work 48 hours later and pretend it didn't happen. You're required to ground yourself, to report what happened, and to go through whatever evaluation process is necessary before you're cleared to fly again. Emerson didn't do that. He was dealing with grief. He'd made a terrible decision to use drugs to cope with that grief. And then he compounded that terrible decision by not self reporting and instead showing up for work. I understand the human element here. If you're struggling, if you're in a bad place mentally, the idea of reporting yourself and potentially losing your job, losing your livelihood, that's a terrifying prospect. You want to push through, you want to pretend everything is normal, you want to get back to your routine because maybe that will help you feel better. But this is exactly why those reporting requirements exist. Because when you're in the cockpit of a commercial aircraft, you're not just responsible for yourself. You're responsible for everyone on that airplane and everyone on the ground below you. And if you're not fit to fly, if your judgment is impaired, if your mental state is compromised, you have an absolute obligation to remove yourself from that situation, regardless of the personal consequences. The fact that Emerson didn't do that nearly resulted in a catastrophic loss of life. And it's only through a combination of good engineering, quick thinking by the operating crew, and frankly, luck that everyone survived. Now, let me address Emerson's claim that he thought he was dreaming, that none of this felt real to him. I'm skeptical of that explanation, and here's why. Even if the initial grab for those fire handles happened in some kind of dissociative state, even if his perception of reality was so distorted by lack of sleep and residual drug effects that he genuinely didn't understand what he was doing in that moment, what happened afterward tells a different story. He got into a physical fight with the first officer. He was forcibly removed from the cockpit. The door was shut behind him. He was in the cabin with flight attendants and passengers around him. And according to reports, he then attempted to open a cabin door. At that point, you're awake. You're aware. You know where you are and what you're doing. So for him to claim later that he thought it was all a dream, I don't buy it. I think this was a suicide attempt. And I think he was willing to take everyone else with him, either because he didn't care or because in his disturbed mental state, he'd convinced himself that he was somehow helping them or that none of it mattered. But again, the legal system has already rendered its judgment. Emerson has been sentenced. That chapter is closed. What we can do now is learn from it, and there are several lessons here that are worth discussing. First and most obviously, the jump seat system, while incredibly useful and generally safe, creates a vulnerability. The person sitting in that seat has physical access to critical aircraft controls. They're sitting right behind the pilots with fire handles, gear handles, flap controls, all within reach. The assumption has always been that anyone in that seat is a trained professional who would never misuse that access. This incident proves that assumption wrong. It doesn't mean we need to eliminate jump seats, but it does mean we need to think carefully about screening, about mental health support for pilots, about creating an environment where people feel safe self-reporting issues rather than hiding them out of fear. Second, this incident highlights the importance of crew resource management and quick thinking under pressure. Right, and the first officer in this case did everything right. He recognized unusual behavior early. He engaged with Emerson in a non-threatening way initially. And when the situation escalated, he acted decisively to protect the aircraft and everyone on board. The captain also performed exactly as trained, immediately declaring an emergency, coordinating with air traffic control, and ensuring that someone was always flying the airplane, even in the middle of a physical altercation in the cockpit. These two pilots saved 80 lives that day through their professionalism and their ability to perform under the most extreme pressure imaginable. Third, we need to continue having honest conversations about mental health in aviation. The culture has improved significantly over the years. There's much more awareness now about the importance of psychological well-being, about the dangers of the old tough it out mentality that pervaded aviation for so long. But we still have work to do. Pilots need to know that if they're struggling, if they're dealing with grief or depression or substance abuse or any other issue that could affect their fitness to fly, there are resources available, and that using those resources won't automatically end their career. We need systems that encourage people to come forward rather than hide their problems until they reach a crisis point. Looking at this incident from start to finish, from Emerson's decision to use drugs while grieving, to his failure to self-report, to his breakdown in the cockpit, to the heroic response of the operating crew, to the emergency landing and arrest, to the legal proceedings and final sentencing, every step of this story offers something to learn from. And while the outcome could have been so much worse, While we should be grateful that everyone survived and that the safety systems worked as designed, we can't ignore the fact that this happened at all. An off-duty pilot, someone who should have been the last person to pose a threat, nearly brought down an aircraft full of people. So as we wrap up this analysis, I want you to remember those voices you heard in the cockpit voice recorder audio, the concern in the first officer's voice as he tried to talk Emerson down, the breathlessness and near panic in the captain's voice as he declared the emergency, the automated systems warning about low speed because nobody was actively flying for those critical seconds. These aren't just data points in an incident report. These are real human beings dealing with a nightmare scenario that they never trained for because nobody thought they'd need to train for it. And they rose to the occasion. They kept their heads, they protected their passengers, they got that aircraft on the ground safely. And for that, they deserve recognition and respect. If you found this analysis valuable, if you learned something from hearing this rare cockpit voice recorder audio and understanding the context around it, please hit that subscribe button. We'll continue covering incidents like this as they develop, always with the goal of education and understanding rather than sensationalism. Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts on this incident, on mental health in aviation, on the jump seat system, or on anything else we discussed today. And remember, every time you board an aircraft, there are professionals in that cockpit who have dedicated their lives to keeping you safe, who have trained for every conceivable emergency, and who take their responsibility seriously. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.